Picture this. You're 25, scrolling through your phone at 2 a.m. Climate disasters flash across your screen. Political chaos, economic collapse, mental health crises, wars that seem to multiply like a virus. And somewhere in the back of your mind, a question begins to form. A question so dark, so unsettling, that most people push it away the moment it surfaces. What if bringing a child into this world is not an act of love, but an act of cruelty? This isn't the ranting of some misanthropic edgelord. This is anti-natalism, a philosophical position that's gaining traction among intelligent, compassionate people who look at the state of existence and conclude that the ethical choice is to abstain from creating new life. And here's what's terrifying about it. The logic is almost bulletproof. Consider the argument in its purest form. Every conscious being that has ever existed has suffered. Not might suffer, will suffer. Heartbreak, loss, physical pain, existential dread, the slow decay of aging, and ultimately, death. These aren't possibilities, they're guarantees. When you create a new person, you are sentencing them to experience all of this without ever asking their permission. The anti-natalist looks at this reality and asks, how is this not a form of cosmic child abuse? But here's where it gets even more unsettling. The person you create doesn't just suffer. They become capable of inflicting suffering on others. They consume resources. They contribute to systems of oppression. They might become the very thing that causes other people's pain. You're not just creating a victim, you're potentially creating a perpetrator. So the anti-natalist presents us with what seems like an inescapable conclusion. If you truly care about reducing suffering in the world, the most ethical thing you can do is refuse to participate in the creation of more beings capable of suffering. And this leaves us with a question that cuts to the very heart of what it means to be human. If life inevitably contains more pain than pleasure, if consciousness itself is a burden we never asked for, then what possible justification is there for perpetuating the human experiment? What if the anti-natalists are right? What if the kindest thing our species could do is simply stop? The feeling that existence might be a mistake is not new. It's not some byproduct of modern anxiety or social media doom scrolling. This darkness has been brewing in the human psyche for millennia, whispered by mystics, codified by philosophers, and felt in the bones of anyone who has stared into the void long enough to see it staring back. The ancient Gnostics believed that the material world was a prison, a flawed creation by a lesser god who had trapped pure souls in flesh and suffering. Early Buddhist teaching spoke of dukkha, the pervasive suffering that permeates all existence like a slow poison. But it wasn't until the 19th century that someone had the courage to build an entire philosophical system around this intuition. Enter Arthur Schopenhauer, the architect of modern pessimism. Schopenhauer looked at human existence and saw something that most philosophers had missed, or perhaps had been too optimistic to acknowledge. He saw that beneath all human action, all desire, all striving, there was a blind, irrational force he called the will to live. This wasn't consciousness making rational choices. This was something much more primitive and terrifying. Imagine the will as a starving man who is offered food. He devours it eagerly, but the meal doesn't satisfy his hunger, it only makes him hungrier. So he eats more and becomes more desperate. The satisfaction he seeks is always just out of reach, and each moment of temporary relief only increases his overall torment. This, Schopenhauer argued, is the human condition. We want something. We get it. But getting it doesn't end our wanting. It only creates new wants, more intense and more painful than before. The successful businessman wants more success. The person in love wants more love. The person who achieves recognition wants more recognition. There is no end point to desire, only an endless cycle of craving and temporary satisfaction that quickly transforms into new craving. But here's the truly horrifying part. Even if we could somehow satisfy all our desires, Schopenhauer observed, we wouldn't be happy. Pause for a moment. We'd be bored. And boredom, he noted, is just another form of suffering. The suffering of unfulfilled potential, of consciousness with nothing meaningful to focus on. So human life becomes trapped between two poles of misery, the agony of want and the emptiness of having. We suffer when we don't get what we desire, and we suffer when we do get it and realize it wasn't what we thought it would be. This led to Schopenhauer's most famous and chilling conclusion. All satisfaction, or what is commonly called happiness, is really and essentially always negative only and never positive. Pleasure is not something real, it's just the temporary absence of pain. Joy is not a substance, it's just the momentary relief from suffering. And if this is true, then existence itself becomes a debt that can only be paid off by death. Life is not a gift. It's a burden we carry until we're finally allowed to set it down. Schopenhauer's ideas didn't die with him. They infected other brilliant minds like a philosophical virus. Émile Cioran would later argue that consciousness itself was an evolutionary mistake, that humans had developed the capacity for self-awareness beyond what was compatible with happiness. Peter Wessel Zopf suggested that civilization was just an elaborate coping mechanism, a collective delusion we maintain to avoid confronting the fundamental absurdity of existence.
These weren't madmen ranting in the streets. These were some of the most penetrating intellects in human history, and they all arrived at the same devastating conclusion. It would have been better if conscious life had never evolved at all. But why does this philosophy feel so compelling to so many people today? Why does a 19th century German philosopher's bleak worldview resonate with a generation raised on smartphones and social media? The answer lies not just in the external conditions of modern life, but in the very architecture of the human mind itself. Your brain is not designed to make you happy. It's designed to keep you alive. And there's a crucial difference between these two goals that creates the foundation for pessimistic thinking. Evolutionary psychologists have identified something called negativity bias, the tendency for our brains to give much more weight to negative experiences than positive ones. If you had 10 good interactions and 1 bad interaction in a day, which one will you be thinking about when you're trying to fall asleep? The bad one. This isn't a character flaw, it's a survival mechanism that kept our ancestors alive. The person who remembered where the poisonous berries grew was more likely to survive than the person who remembered where the sweet berries grew. The individual who could detect potential threats in every shadow lived longer than the one who assumed everything was safe. Over millions of years of evolution, we became exquisitely attuned to danger, suffering, and loss. This system worked perfectly when humans lived in small tribes where the scope of potential threats was limited to your immediate environment. But now we carry devices in our pockets that expose us to every tragedy, every crisis, every form of suffering happening anywhere on the planet in real time, 24 hours a day. Your Stone Age brain, with its negativity bias intact, is trying to process school shootings in America, genocides in Africa, natural disasters in Asia, and political upheavals in Europe as if they're all immediate threats to your personal safety. The result is a kind of psychological overwhelm that makes the world feel infinitely more dangerous and hopeless than it actually is. But it gets worse. We don't just consume this information passively. We actively seek it out. There's a term for this behavior: doom scrolling. We compulsively refresh our feeds, looking for the next piece of terrible news, like addicts chasing a hit. And why do we do this? Because our brains are convinced that staying informed about threats, even threats we can't possibly influence, is somehow keeping us safe. Meanwhile, positive news gets processed and forgotten quickly. Our brain says, "Okay, that's nice, nothing to worry about there," and moves on. But negative news gets stored, cataloged, and referenced repeatedly. It becomes evidence in an ongoing case that the world is fundamentally broken. This creates what psychologists call a cognitive availability cascade, where the information that's most easily recalled, the negative information, becomes overrepresented in our assessment of reality. We start to believe that school shootings are more common than they are, that crime is higher than it is, that the world is more violent than it is, simply because these stories are more memorable and more frequently repeated. But there's an even deeper psychological force at work here, something that goes beyond bias and touches the very core of human consciousness. Terror management theory suggests that the awareness of our own mortality creates a profound underlying anxiety that influences almost every aspect of human behavior. Think about it. You are the only species on Earth that knows with absolute certainty that you will die. Not just intellectually, but viscerally. You carry this knowledge with you every moment of every day, and this knowledge creates what psychologists call existential terror, a deep, primal fear that can never be fully resolved. Most of the time, we manage this terror through what researchers call death denial. Elaborate psychological and cultural systems that help us feel like we're part of something larger and more permanent than our individual lives. But what happens when these systems break down? What happens when traditional sources of meaning feel hollow or untrustworthy? The existential terror breaks through, and suddenly the anti-natalist position doesn't sound like philosophical speculation, it sounds like merciful wisdom. If consciousness inevitably leads to the awareness of mortality, and if the awareness of mortality creates inescapable suffering, then perhaps the kindest thing we can do is ensure that no new consciousness ever has to confront this terrible knowledge. There's one more psychological mechanism that feeds into pessimistic thinking, and it's perhaps the most insidious of all: the hedonic treadmill. Research shows that humans have a remarkable ability to return to a relatively stable level of happiness despite major positive or negative life events. Win the lottery, and within a year you'll probably be about as happy as you were before. Lose a limb, and within a year you'll probably have adapted to a similar level of life satisfaction. On the surface, this sounds like good news. We're resilient. But looked at from another angle, it's devastating. It means that no amount of success, achievement, or positive experience can provide lasting happiness. The hedonic treadmill ensures that we're always running toward the next thing, convinced that this time will be different, this time we'll finally reach lasting satisfaction. But we never do. We can't. The treadmill just keeps moving, and we keep running, and the destination never gets any closer. When you combine all of these factors, negativity bias, information overwhelm, existential terror, and the hedonic treadmill, you get a perfect storm for pessimistic thinking. And this storm has been supercharged by the unique conditions of modern life.
In the digital age, the philosophical and psychological forces that have always pushed humans toward pessimism have been amplified to an unprecedented degree. We're not just dealing with the timeless challenges of consciousness and mortality. We're dealing with technological and social systems that seem designed to exploit our deepest vulnerabilities and feed our darkest intuitions about existence. The algorithms that govern our information consumption aren't neutral. They're optimized for engagement, and engagement is most easily achieved through emotional arousal. Fear, anger, outrage, and despair are much more engaging than contentment, satisfaction, or quiet joy. So the algorithmic systems that increasingly mediate our relationship with reality have a built-in bias towards showing us content that confirms our worst suspicions about the world. This creates what researchers call filter bubbles or echo chambers. But the effect goes deeper than political polarization. It creates reality tunnels of despair. If you spend enough time consuming algorithmically curated content, you'll start to believe that school shootings happen every day, that the economy is always on the verge of collapse, that political violence is inevitable, and that environmental catastrophe is imminent and irreversible. The algorithm doesn't care whether this information is representative of actual reality. It only cares whether it keeps you scrolling. But the problem isn't just the information we consume. It's the information we produce and how it makes us feel about our own lives. Social media platforms have gamified human connection, turning our relationships into performative competitions for likes, shares, and comments. We curate our online presence to show only our best moments, our greatest achievements, our happiest experiences. But we consume everyone else's curated highlights while comparing them to our own unfiltered reality. The result is a constant, low-grade sense of inadequacy and isolation. Everyone else seems to be living a more interesting, more successful, more fulfilling life than you are. This phenomenon has been called compare and despair, and it's particularly devastating for young people who are forming their basic understanding of what normal adult life looks like. When your reference point for normalcy is everyone else's highlight reel, your own ordinary struggles and mundane disappointments feel like evidence of personal failure. Meanwhile, the traditional sources of meaning and community that previous generations relied on have been systematically dismantled. Local clubs, religious institutions, extended family networks, neighborhood communities, all of these have weakened or disappeared entirely for many people. In previous eras, when someone was struggling with existential questions about the meaning of life or the justification for having children, they were embedded in communities that could provide perspective, support, and guidance. There were elders who had lived through difficult times and could offer wisdom. There were peers who were facing similar challenges and could offer solidarity. Now, many people face these profound questions in isolation, with only algorithmic feeds and curated social media posts as their guides. Is it any wonder that anti-natalism seems not just reasonable, but inevitable? The economic pressures of modern life add another layer of practical despair to the philosophical and psychological foundation. For many young people, the decision not to have children isn't primarily a philosophical choice. It's a pragmatic response to economic reality. Previous generations could expect that hard work and education would lead to stable employment, homeownership, and the financial security necessary to support a family. Those expectations no longer match reality for many people. Student debt, housing costs, healthcare expenses, and job insecurity have made the prospect of raising children feel not just philosophically questionable, but practically impossible. When having a child means choosing between your own financial stability and theirs, when it means working multiple jobs and still struggling to provide basic necessities, when it means bringing someone into a world where even middle-class life feels precarious, the anti-natalist position stops sounding like abstract philosophy and starts sounding like practical wisdom. All of these forces, algorithmic manipulation, social media comparison, community dissolution, and economic precarity, feed into the same conclusion that Schopenhauer reached 2 centuries ago. Existence is primarily characterized by suffering, and the ethical response is to avoid creating more sufferers. But here's what makes our current moment uniquely dangerous. Unlike previous generations who might have reached similar conclusions, we have the technological and social infrastructure
to actually implement antinatalism on a massive scale. Birth rates in developed countries are already falling below replacement levels. The systems are already in place for humanity to simply fade away, not through catastrophe or violence, but through a collective decision to stop. And this brings us to the crucial question. Even if the antinatalist critique of existence is accurate, even if consciousness is primarily suffering and life is primarily struggle, is their proposed solution actually preferable to the alternative? If the antinatalists are right about suffering, if consciousness is indeed a burden and existence is indeed more pain than pleasure, then their logic appears unassailable. The math is simple. Zero consciousness equals zero suffering. No people, no problems. But what if they're asking the wrong question entirely? What if the fundamental premise of antinatalism, that life should be evaluated as an individual balance sheet of pleasure versus pain, is flawed from the beginning? What if the purpose of human existence isn't individual happiness, but something else entirely? Consider this possibility. What if meaning isn't something we find, but something we create together? What if the value of consciousness isn't in the experiences it contains, but in the connections it makes possible? When you shift the frame from individual experience to collective creation, everything changes. A parent doesn't just create a being who will suffer, they create someone who will love and be loved. They create someone who will contribute to the vast ongoing project of human knowledge, art, culture, and connection. Think about what would be lost if the antinatalists got their way. Not just future people, but the entire accumulated heritage of human civilization. Every piece of music that has ever brought comfort to a grieving person. Every scientific discovery that has reduced suffering. Every work of art that has helped someone feel less alone. Every moment of genuine connection between human beings. The antinatalist looks at a parent and child and sees the imposition of suffering on an unwilling victim. But what if we're looking at something else entirely? What if we're looking at the fundamental building block of meaning itself, the choice to care for another being, not because they asked to be cared for, but because caring is what transforms existence from mere biological process and to something approaching the sacred? This is not about denying suffering. The antinatalists are absolutely correct that every conscious being will experience pain, loss, heartbreak, and ultimately death. But they make a crucial error in assuming that the alternative to suffering is non-existence, when the actual alternative to suffering is not non-existence, it's connection. When someone you love is in pain, you don't wish they had never been born. You wish you could take their pain away, or at least share it with them. The response to suffering isn't to eliminate the sufferer. It's to ensure that no one suffers alone. And this is what gets lost in the antinatalist calculus. The profound human capacity to make suffering bearable through relationship. A life of isolated, painless non-existence is not superior to a life of shared struggle and shared triumph. It's not even comparable because it's not a life at all. The choice to have a child, when viewed from this perspective, becomes something radically different from what the antinatalists describe. It's not the imposition of suffering on an unwilling victim. It's an act of profound faith, faith in the power of human connection to create meaning in the face of meaninglessness, purpose in the face of absurdity, hope in the face of despair. It's the ultimate expression of commitment to the human project. But this raises a deeper question, one that cuts to the heart of what it means to be human. Is the web of human connection, with all its love, art, knowledge, and shared history, worth continuing? Is the ongoing conversation between generations, the passing down of wisdom and beauty and meaning, valuable enough to justify the suffering it inevitably contains? The antinatalist says no. They say the ethical calculation is clear. The suffering outweighs the beauty,
The pain outweighs the connection, the cost outweighs the benefit. But this isn't really a calculation that can be resolved through logic or evidence. It's a choice that each generation must make for itself. And the choice isn't really about whether life contains more pleasure than pain. The choice is about whether you believe that consciousness, relationship, and the ongoing human conversation about meaning are valuable enough to preserve. The anti-natalists have done us a service by forcing us to confront this choice directly. They've stripped away the comforting illusions and convenient assumptions that usually surround discussions of procreation and meaning. They've made us face the reality that existence is hard, that consciousness comes with genuine costs, that bringing new people into the world is a decision with profound moral implications. But their conclusion, that the ethical response to this reality is extinction, rests on a conception of value that may be too narrow to capture what's actually at stake. Because here's what the anti-natalist framework can't account for: the possibility that meaning emerges not from individual experience, but from the relationships between individuals. The possibility that consciousness is valuable not for what it contains, but for what it makes possible. The possibility that the human project, this extraordinary experiment in self-aware beings creating meaning together, is worth preserving, not because it eliminates suffering, but because it transforms suffering into something that can be shared, understood, and transcended. The question is not, is an individual life worth the suffering it will contain? The question is the ongoing conversation between human beings about what it means to be human worth continuing? And that question doesn't have a logical answer. It has a human answer, an answer that each of us must give with our choices, our relationships, our commitments, and ultimately our faith in the possibility that consciousness, for all its costs, is still a miracle worth preserving. The anti-natalists have shown us the darkness. Now we must decide whether the light is worth keeping alive.